Also joining is Mr. Elson Lowe, Treasurer of the People's National Congress Reform and Economy. Welcome. Today's first statement will be read in two parts, and we will start with the Leader of the Opposition.
Latest developments at Mocha, Arcadia, Caneview expose PPP true nature as wicked, vindictive, and a racist regime. The PPPC having claimed that the people of Caneview, Mocha were in the path of the new East Bank Road and proceeded to use an excavator to destroy their property and livelihood, is now showing that the PPPC regime is wicked, destructive, vindictive, and racist since the people are not in the pathway of the highway. Having brutally destroyed the property of African Guyanese at Caneview, Mocha, the PPP has now allocated lands to PPP family, friends, and favorites that are much closer to the road and permitting them to build on those lands. In one case, a concrete fence is already constructed on the land just over the road from the lands on which they destroyed the property of poor African Guyanese. The opposition calls on the PPP to allocate those lands to the people they removed and to compensate them for the physical and socio-psychological damage they have done to these poor Guyanese citizens. As we iterate that the PNCRA-PNU in government will have the people of Caneview give back their lands and compensate them for their sufferings under this brutal PPP regime. PPP must end the use of REOs, town clerks, and overseers to control and dominate local government organs. The PPP continues to use regional executive officer, town clerks, and overseers to dominate and control all regional democratic council, town council, and neighborhood democratic councils, including those won by the APNU. This is unacceptable and needs to come to an end. The PPP is violating the Constitution of Ghana, since these officers are servants of the councils and should be allowed to operate as independent professional public servants serving their respective councils and not the PPP government. In Linden, the PPP government has appointed Lennox Gasper, one of its political lackeys, to the post of town clerk. Apart from Mr. Gasper's political partisanship activities, he is incompetent and unfit to be a town clerk. More importantly, he is sabotaging the work of the council and allegedly refusing to sign off on legitimate payments for citizens of Linden. In the process, he's frustrating many hardworking people in Linden and working against the interests of the people of Linden. The opposition wishes to condemn the high-handed and political partisan approach of the town clerk and calls on the government to remove him from office as we express solidarity with the mayor and town council of Linden and the people of Linden. The record of the town clerk does not make good reading. Mr. Lennox Gasper was imposed on the people of Linden on the 2nd of November 2023 and was appointed twice for the same position January 2nd, 2024. These appointments were both conducted by flawed processes, with Mr. Gasper being the only candidate to be interviewed for the position. Since this imposition, Gasper has been unwilling to carry out the recommendations, decisions, and policies of the councils in keeping with Chapter 2801. His regular walking out of committee meetings, extraordinary and statutory meetings, have shown a pattern of behavior that is unacceptable and hinders the progress of the town of Linden. His actions have resulted in frustration and protest action by the people of Linden who have no confidence in Mr. Gasper as town clerk. The vendors on Monday, July the 5th, 2024, at a meeting held at Mackenzie Market Square, angered by the pileup of garbage, came to the council on Wednesday, July 7th, 2024, at the statutory meeting and further expressed their concerns. At the meeting, Mr. Gasper attempted to lock residents out of the meeting while allowing only 10 members, PPP members, who are on the last local government list to attend. This regard for people's right to freely assemble must be condemned. What is worse, two high-ranking police officers, an inspector, and sergeant were invited into the council chambers to, quote, bring order, unquote. While the municipality has its own constabulary, this is another indication of the politicization of the Guyana Police Force and its misuse to trample the rights of the Guyanese people. Clearly, this was an attempt to intimidate residents of Linden and councillors. They will not be intimidated. In the midst of all this confusion and PPP incompetence, the opposition calls on the government to appoint members to the Local Government Commission in keeping with the Constitution of Guyana.
Sir Alvin.
The Petroleum Commission should not be misconceived as totally replacing government, but conceived as working under its general directions. Our position on the necessity for a Petroleum Commission is clear. As the next government, we will establish such a commission within our first year in office. However, we have recently noted some misunderstanding about the role and powers of such a body, and particularly its statutory relationship with the government of the day. Vice President Barajagio at his press conference yesterday, for example, lamented that a Petroleum Commission, in his view, would be ill-suited in situations where hard choices and judgment calls have to be made. His staunch resistance to the establishment of a commission is obviously informed by his fear that such a body will completely render him and the government totally powerless or irrelevant, even when political or policy decisions must be made. Likewise, the Kaitro News editorial today misconceives the Petroleum Commission as a completely independent body, that is, independent of government general direction and supervision. It is important to correct these misconceptions and to offer our understanding of the role and authority of a Petroleum Commission. In our view, such a commission is expected to perform three broad functions. One, implement the policies of the government in the exploration, development, and production of petroleum in Guyana. Two, monitor and regulate petroleum activities to ensure operations comply with all applicable laws, agreements, and technical standards. And three, serve as the source of technical knowledge and expertise on petroleum activities to guide its own operations and to advise the government. These broad functions are captured in the draft Petroleum Commission of Guyana bill. This bill, and those acts of parliament establishing similar agencies, such as the Guyana Geology and Mines Commission, provide the government, through the relevant minister, the power to give general directions to the commission. In our view, such a political direction is necessary in principle and practice because ultimately it is the government of the day that is answerable to the citizens for the management of the nation's natural resources. In the case of Guyana's oil sector, its sheer financial and economic size makes government's involvement even more critical and obligatory. However, general direction cannot constitute political interference in the day-to-day management of the work of the Petroleum Commission. However, such a commission, if allowed to properly function, has enormous statutory authority and scope to make a wide range of strategic and operational decisions without the need to seek the minister's signature. As the next government, we will provide the breathing space for the Commission to perform all its functions with the minimum of government interference outside of broad policy guidelines. In this regard, ensuring that the Commission can craft and fund its own budget through fees from petroleum activities, hire its own staff, contract outside experts, draft its own plans, and exercise similar self-governing powers will promote its professionalism and independence. We therefore do not envisage the Petroleum Commission as an absolute power unto itself. Rather, we see it as a professional and expert agency, executing broad government policies, providing technical advice and services to the government, and monitoring and regulating petroleum activities. Irfan Ali and his cost of living propaganda have convinced no one. For any government to be taken seriously when it talks about economic policy, it must at minimum know the unemployment and inflation rates. Policymakers, central bankers, international agencies, and the media monitor these key data points closely to help evaluate the health of an economy, the effectiveness of economic policy making, and the well-being of people. However, the PPP operates in its own world. It does not calculate, let alone publish, official unemployment figures, and its inflation numbers are highly suspect. Even now, the government clings to pronouncements about 2% inflation in 2023, which means it believes prices did not change significantly all last year, whereas the IMF and US government numbers for Guyana of 4.5 and 6.6% respectively are far higher. When, therefore, the president said recently that the PPP had done quote unquote a lot to cushion the cost of living, he was talking purely about input measures, how much money the government spent, but was completely ignorant of whether those expenditures had any impact on unemployment and inflation rates, otherwise known as the misery index. The PPP does not care to know if these rates keep increasing. Its only concern is to try to mislead the Guyanese public that the cost of living is under control because the government has spent so much money here and there. But as we said at the previous press conference, the president and his vice president should sit in the kitchens of ordinary Guyanese families to face the harsh realities. The government tries to confuse the Guyanese people in another way. Even if we assume inflation has been tamed, it still means that the cost of living remains high from previous spikes in inflation since 2020. Moreover, if income levels have effectively stagnated, as they have since 2020, then Guyanese will still struggle to make ends meet, as they are today. On the question of the country's non existent unemployment figures, the government is unable to determine what effect its spending is having on Guyanese's access to an income. If money is being spent but it's not generating jobs that Guyanese can fill, then clearly they will not be able to weather this cost of living crisis. The large expenditure on infrastructure, for instance, is not creating a proportional number of jobs across the country because, as admitted by Vice President Jagdeo, a lot of contracts are going only to a small network of friends, families, and favorites. The multiple delayed school rebuilding projects from Linden to Georgetown, roadworks like Cemetery Road, Conversation Tree, and Thomas Lands, and pump contracts where little to no work has been done also compound the unemployment situation as workers are often sent home by contractors. President Ali does not know the effect of his government's policies, and he and his propaganda cannot change that reality. Only totalitarian regimes that seek to manipulate and control the public, hide unemployment and inflation numbers. We must not let the PPP get away with normalizing governance that is anything but normal. Factual inflation numbers must return to government statements and publications, and regular monitoring of the unemployment rate must resume. What is happening in Guyana is totally bizarre, and a kleptocratic government is the only one that would be comfortable driving the Guyanese economy on with no idea where it is headed.
Okay. At this time, I'll open the floor for questions on the press statement. All right, so questions on the press statement? Any other questions?
Sharika, while we're waiting for the media to gather its questions, there's one thing that we wanted to make sure we clarify based off of Vice President Jagdeo's statements regarding the interest issue for the offshore oil operations. The first thing we want to make clear is that it is not merely because this is an issue that is in the papers that we decided to speak on it, but rather it was Vice President Jagdeo himself saying that he was going to rely on the audit to determine whether or not interest was being charged to Guyana for these operations. Now, that piqued our attention because the audit is not where you would go to look for this. And so we immediately were worried that he had no idea as to what exactly was going on. In fact, his additional statements have indicated his attitude on the issue because he's also talked about if it's not Exxon that is charging the Guyanese people interest, it is the builder of the FPSOs, SPM, which is charging interest. So it is indeed that interest is being charged. It's just by a different corporation in the chain of production. But his attitude again seems to be whatever the interest is, it is, and the government has no interest, doesn't care about that. Now, an FPSO costs about as much as the entire national budget of Guyana in years gone by. So you can't just palm that issue off and not pay attention as to the implications, as to the costs, and look at what it is that could be the interest rate coming out of that. That again indicates why a petroleum commission is so important to help us to evaluate these types of expenses, to help us to be more knowledgeable about these types of expenses, and to make informed decisions when we engage with the operator in discussions. Now, his attitude really smacks of someone who I think lacks experience dealing with large numbers. Because to me, to see an FPSO, which is a multi-billion dollar expense, and to dismiss it out of hand, indicates that he's not really aware of the implications of his attitude. So that's something we wanted to clarify on the interest issue going forward.
Thank you. All right, are there questions on anything outside of the first statement? All right. With there being no questions, I want to thank our media personnel for joining today's press and, of course, our viewing audience. And we do hope you have a wonderful weekend.